This morning when I woke up, I actually texted Rachel, who facilitates on the opposite Sundays here at Wild Heart. So, I think she was here last week. I'm here this week. And I texted her and I said, what's our topic? What are we talking about? And she said the 10 paramis, which are up on the board. And I said, cool, where are we at? And she said, wisdom. I was like, sweet, wisdom, that's a great one. And I woke up this morning and I just was not feeling it. My first thought of the day, actually, someone said the word lofty, and that's what it felt like. I was like, it feels like a heavy lift. It just felt like wisdom sometimes can feel like I've got to really put my thinking brain on. And so that's where I was at this morning, and it wasn't so much that I had this thought, I don't want to talk about wisdom, but it was more of this kind of attitude, this heavy lift. And so I looked into it. I was like, all right, what's this about? And upon deeper investigation, I realized that it wasn't so much that the topic was lofty or I didn't have the brain power. I think I was still waking up, so there was some of that. But I actually haven't felt very wise lately. And for about 2 minutes, I was kind of trying to wiggle out of it. I was like, well, I could talk about loving kindness. We don't have to go in order. We're Buddhists, right? I was trying to wiggle out of it because the truth be told, I haven't been meditating that much lately. And my relationship has changed quite a bit to this practice over the last couple years, especially since having a kid. And recovering from burnout as a mental health provider during the pandemic, and feeling like there's much more of a requirement out of me as a father to be financially responsible and work more and pause. Take a breath. Dang, that was my mind this morning. That narrative, a lot of narrative was coming up for me, all of which that stuff is true. But that's a lot of self-narrative that was coming up. And so I stopped and I just said, okay, self-doubt, self-doubt, self-doubt. And when I was in Myanmar, I've told this story before, I was on this month-long retreat and I learned this noting practice, just like I did right there, where you simply note whatever your experience is. And about a couple weeks into the retreat, I was having a rough mental day. It was a very rigorous retreat. We're meditating 16 hours a day in 4-hour blocks. And so I did the first morning block, and it was just irritability. My mind was so agitated, and I was feeling homesick, and I was like, I don't think I'm prepared for this. And I go into a scheduled check-in with one of the senior monks, and I sit down. He doesn't speak English that well. And I say, I'm feeling homesick, and all this stuff's coming up, and I'm feeling pretty agitated. And he said, blah, 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 blah. Doubt. Doubt, 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 doubt. Back to the breath. And I left that meeting what just happened there? I was looking for some empathy. I was, I think this is some cultural difference, right? In language barrier, I was looking for this empathy, and that would have been nice too, don't get me wrong. But it actually was really nice to have this simple instruction to just note the doubt. And paradoxically, this is actually what wisdom is. So I experienced wisdom this morning as my mind was telling me all of these stories around how and why I shouldn't have this talk, or why I don't want to give this talk, or why I don't feel particularly connected to it. And I was able to pause and just say, oh, wow, there's a lot of self-narrative happening right now. It's not my fault. I'm not blaming. I'm just observing. Isn't that interesting? And I could breathe and come back to my breath and start over. And so wisdom is not about our intellect. And as many times as I learn this, I forget this, and that's a part of wisdom too, right? Wisdom is about learning the same thing over and over again. This has been my experience. It's not knowledge as an idea. It's experiential knowledge that we gain through clearly seeing from our experience what it's like in here, what it's like in the mind, what it's like to be human. So wisdom for me is not about my intellect. It's also not a quality of our personality. Like, I actually love whoever said old person. Because one of the first things that comes to mind is like various people that I think are wise, right? And it's someone that often feels kind of confident or unbothered or has these kind of pithy sayings or, something of the sort. And even though that is what often comes to mind, it's not that. It's not an attribute of our personality. It's not our intellect, and it's also not a state of mind that exists separately from our stress and suffering. From this word in Buddhism we call dukkha. Wisdom and dukkha, stress and suffering, can co-arise. Actually, we want them to. You can have a head full of reactivity, a head full of self-doubt, a head full of anger, and still have wisdom. Because one of the core things that the Buddha is encouraging us to look at is how our happiness is not dependent on things being a certain way. Wisdom is not dependent on you feeling a certain way. Feeling confident, feeling capable, feeling like you want to talk about wisdom this morning at Wild Heart. Wisdom's not dependent on that. Wisdom, from my own experience, is a clear seeing into the nature of this experience here and now. So for me, wisdom is always about the here and now. I can use concepts, ideas, I can use things I've learned and read in the Buddhist text to help inform my perception of the here and now, and that helps. Right? The Buddha even says one of the things that give rise to wisdom, he says 2, continuous awareness here and now. That's the one I'm leaning on. And the second one is the words of a wise friend. Things people have said, things people can share. Applying that to the here and now is definitely helpful. And it's really this quality of seeing clearly into the thoughts of the here and now, the mind states of the here and now, the feeling tones of the here and now, the sensations of the here and now. These are what we call the 4 foundations of mindfulness. Sometimes these 4 foundations are called pastures, and the Buddha uses this metaphor, it's like herding cattle. He says you want to guide your awareness like you're guiding cattle through these 4 pastures of your present experience. And so the interesting thing is sensations, feelings, mental states, and thoughts, they're all occurring in the present all the time. And so we kind of guide our awareness, direct our awareness into these fields, and we cultivate through that process wisdom, clear seeing. So this morning I was able to see, let me back up from this narrative and just see the narrative. Right? That's such a subtle thing. Someone used the word subtle when we were doing the word association. I like that. That's such a subtle thing, to be aware of a thought rather than to be identified with the thought. If someone was to ask me, well, what's so great about meditation? If I could articulate that, which can be hard to articulate, it helps me to be aware of the thoughts instead of identified with the thoughts. That's incredibly powerful. It's the difference between me telling some story about how or whether I'm capable of giving this talk this morning and where my practice is at and comparing myself to where I used to be or comparing myself to other people. It's the difference between going through hours of that doubt and just having a moment of, wow, let's take a step back from that for a second. and starting over. In old me, it could have been the difference between not only going through a couple hours, but literally not showing up here. Listening to that thought, to wiggle out of it and to say, hey, you know what? I'm not feeling well this morning and someone else can do it. Right? How many times have my self-narratives, not of any fault of my own, but these narratives in my mind talked me out of engaging with life? So it's very powerful. Wisdom doesn't mean that there's not reactivity in our mind. If you have a mind, sometimes there will be reactivity there and sometimes there won't. So at first, somewhat reluctantly, and now somewhat excitedly, I'm here this morning to speak on the topic of wisdom, so that's what we're going to talk about. And one thing I've learned about this practice as we shift into talking more about this from a Buddhist perspective is that, if you look at a lot of the Buddhist teachings, in the way that they were written in Pali Sanskrit, a lot of the words are verbs and descriptive verbs. Like an example is the word compassion. In English, the word compassion feels kind of dead to me, to be honest. Like I value that, but that word doesn't evoke anything for me personally, compassion. In Pali Sanskrit, the word is karuna, and karuna means a movement of the heart in response to pain. That's a really beautiful word. That's a long description. But that word karuna, that's what it literally means. It means a movement of the heart in response to pain. And so this word wisdom kind of does the same for me. And there is a word for it in Pali Sanskrit, and it does just mean wisdom. I think it's panya. But I think I would get rid of the word and substitute it for a different word in the Buddhist teachings, which is Dhamma Vichaya, which means an investigation into the nature of things. So what allows wisdom it's not a noun, it's a verb. Wisdom is a process by which we're investigating the nature of things. And I probably told the Buddhist story hundreds of times over the years. And of course, it escaped my mind this morning when I woke up and was going through this narrative and doubt. But the Buddha also, after his awakening, had this moment, and he was enlightened, so they say, and he has this moment of doubt, where he basically has a similar line of thoughts. He's like, what do I do with this experience of awakening that I've been through? Do I teach? That would be a pain in the ass for me. He literally says it would be tiring and vexing. He's like, I would be annoyed if I taught people mindfulness for a living, because he says, and these are his words, he says the reason why it would be annoying, he says because the Dhamma, or the nature of experience, not wisdom, the Dhamma, the nature of experience that I have awoken to, he says is deep, it's hard to see, it's difficult to awaken to, it's quiet and excellent, it's not confined by thought, it's subtle, and it's sensed by the wise, people that are ready to hear it. And he goes on to say, but there are those that have little dust in their eyes, those that are ready to hear it. And I like that metaphor of people with little dust in their eyes. When you're going through a hard time in life and you've tried everything and you've banged your head against the wall and you've gone to the same old habits and behaviors and the same old things that you've tried a million times and they're still not working, and you're finally just at that point of surrender and you're just like, what do I need to do? And you're forced to kind of just sit with what you're experiencing. There's no answer out there. There's no escape route. There's no way to fix it or manage it or control it. You just have to kind of really be present for the suffering. Do y'all know that experience? Hopefully. these are these moments where we have little dust in our eyes. Because on any given day, it's easy for me to just jump back into the workflow and jump back into, the many things that are not problems in my life, but definitely distractions. Bhikkhu Bodhi says we often readjust ourselves into some patched up version of our natural optimism, which is a very cynical way of saying that we kind of are just like, well, today's a new day, right? But the Buddha is saying, no, if you actually stop and slow down and you really look into the source of your dissatisfaction, your suffering, this experience, and you really sit with it, with all escape routes blocked, you can come to terms with it. You can really see what's causing the suffering. And this is through investigation of the mind and the heart. And so there are two levels of wisdom. And as I talk about this, these are just two ways of talking about really the same thing. And one level of talking about wisdom from the Buddhist perspective is what we understand as the Four Noble Truths. And when I first heard this teaching, I was like, okay, so here's the central Buddhist dogma, right? Like the Four Noble Truths. It's like the New Testament of Buddhism. And what I later found out is that this isn't really like a capital T truth. Just like wisdom is not a noun in Buddhism, it's the investigation of your experience, it's a verb. These truths are not really truths with the T, they're more like tasks. So one way that we actively engage with wisdom through the Buddhist lens is that we first, and this is, bear with me here, is we first have to come into a direct relationship with the suffering that we experience. And that, it sucks. And it's also what has made me really trust this practice. And I'll ask you to bear with me as I walk through my experience with this, but we'll have some time to hear from y'all how this resonates. But the Buddha's kind of saying that we have to have an understanding and ultimately a willingness to embrace suffering not as a flaw, but as a feature of our human experience. Because the mind, when we're suffering or when we're going through something difficult, always will assume that it shouldn't be happening. And if you've found different, give me a part of your brain. But my mind on every level will always assume whenever something is difficult, whenever I am stressed, whenever I am suffering, whenever a problem arises at work or with a friend or in a situation, that I have to figure it out, fix it, change it, and get over it. And that if I do, my life will be better. And now I don't consciously have that thought, because I don't believe that, because I know there's going to be more challenges in life and so on and so forth. But my mindset when I'm struggling is really that if I figure this out, I will be happy. If I fix this present, whatever version of that is on the news today in my mind, my mental news, then there will be world peace in my mind. And so the Buddha is saying that not you have to believe this, but can you see that suffering is an inherent fiber of our human condition? That it is part of this realm that we're born into. And suffering exists, and it will continue to exist until all beings uproot greed, hatred, and delusion from deep within their heart and mind. And so I've been playing around with this idea of safety lately, and there's relative safety, and I want to acknowledge that. We want to take really good care of ourselves and not put ourselves in situations that are harmful. And we're going to talk about this later. But then there's this ultimate truth, which is that impermanence is king. There is no place where we can certainly find rest in this changing world of conditions. There's pleasure and there's pain, and there's praise and there's blame, and there's status and recognition and there's disgrace. And there's gain and there's loss, and there's safety and there's harm. It does exist in this realm. And to act like it shouldn't be here is kind of an avoidance of taking some responsibility. And so that's the reason we accept suffering, is because we don't just complacently, and now I'm getting to this point where I can breathe, we don't want to complacently accept the causes and conditions that create it. We have to accept suffering so that we can accept our part in it. And the Buddha is actually structuring his whole teaching around investigating what's causing suffering and what will lead to its end. So from a Buddhist perspective, wisdom is only about suffering and its end. It's not about philosophy. It's not about understanding the texts on Buddhist psychology and where consciousness is created and the links of dependent origination. Understanding those things through experiencing those things can lead to the end of suffering. So I had a teacher one time say that the Dharma is not teachings. It's not practices. It's not systems and structures. The Dharma is the wisdom that arises from using the teachings and those systems and structures skillfully. And so we have to accept that suffering exists and really come to terms with that. And I think that is hard enough. I think that that's really tough. And to be clear, this does not mean that we just say, well, shit happens. This is life. Humans are trash. What can you do? The Buddha told me life is suffering. It's actually not what the Buddha said. The Buddha said, are you willing to take a look at the suffering that exists here? It wasn't a statement. It was an invitation. Are you ready to sit down and take a look at it? Have you ever been going through something really difficult in life, and when you get to that point of surrender I was talking about earlier, and you finally sit down, I don't know how to articulate this, but I've had these moments in life where I've been running from myself, from my experience, and I finally had to sit down and sit with myself. That it wasn't as bad as I thought. It was actually very freeing. There was like freedom within my pain and my grief. Because I thought that there was this thing that was so bad, and I was so uniquely bad for having that thing, that when I finally got to the point where I stopped running, I could connect. Right? I could connect my pain to the pain of others. I didn't feel so alone. It's like I finally spoke this truth of this thing I had tried to hide myself from. So the Buddha gives us a tool. He gives us many tools, actually, for uprooting the cause of suffering. And this is the Noble Eightfold Path. But within that, he gives us meditation, mindfulness, the heart practices. He gives us community. He says community is the whole of the Dharma. We don't wake up alone. We need each other. If we're all suffering, we gotta have some way to hold on to one another, help each other through it. He gives us the tool of generosity and service and says, hey, let's help. Right? I always call it the heroin of spiritual principles, generosity, because you'll never feel good quicker than helping someone else. If you want to change how you feel, guaranteed, or your money back, really put all of your effort and energy into being helpful, and you'll feel better. Right? I don't know why I'm always so resistant to it when I'm caught up in my shit. So he gives us all of these, generosity and community, the heart practices, meditation. He also gives us a guide for moving ourselves through the world with wise speech and wise action, wise livelihood. These are the sila factors that I believe Rachel talked about kind of recently. So mindfulness is not actually like the whole of what the Buddha taught. Mindfulness is not like an ethically neutral productivity skill in Buddhism. Not that it can't be helpful to be productive, but the reason we are mindful is so that we are not causing harm. So we're uprooting greed, so we can practice renunciation, so we can uproot hatred, so we can practice compassion, so we can uproot delusion, and we can practice connection instead of separation. So to be clear, we don't complacently accept suffering. The Buddha gives us practices to intentionally and directly engage with it. And we have to come to terms with the reality that this suffering is not likely to go anywhere anytime soon. And that helps us to be patient. It helps us to learn how to use these practices to steady our hearts and our mind. It's a both and, right? It's a middle path. Suffering is not going away tomorrow, and how can I engage a little bit today? Right? How can I, maybe starting with myself, how can I show up for myself compassionately first? Just a little bit today, and as I do that, maybe I have a little more capacity to show up for Debbie and a friend, and then maybe I have more capacity to show up for my community. Right? And so that's been my experience. So on one level, the Buddha talks about the Four Noble Truths and this truth of dukkha, of suffering, and that it's not going anywhere. It's a fiber of our existence, and he is encouraging us to have this task of being honest about that and engaging with it. And that's not easy, and that's what we're here to do. And on another level, the Buddha talks about this truth of karma. And I want to, so I don't have to give a long-winded description of what karma is, I just want you to forget everything you've learned about karma. It's not a piggy bank in the sky. It's not borrowing actually some of these religious ideas from other things and saying that it's about retribution and all of the things you've done go into this place and they get doled back out to you at a later time and you get reborn in bad realms and all this weird stuff. Maybe that's true, I don't know, but I don't think the Buddha knew either. But what the Buddha did is he actually took this word karma and he redefined it because it was a word that was around long before he ever lived. And he said karma is about action. Karma means action. And he says that karma, actually, he re-empowers the word. It's the reality of cause and effect. It's the understanding that whatever activity the mind, your speech, your behavior engages in gets stronger. So every moment your mind, your speech, your behavior can be engaged in an activity. And the mind gets conditioned around how it wants to engage. And this is actually just kind of behavioral psychology. You know, that's what's kind of cool is later they're like, we're going to call it this. And it was like, all right, that's fine. I'm dead. But yeah, it's just this understanding that whatever you practice, not just in your behavior, we know this with like sports, it's very obvious. You practice an instrument even, you're going to get better at it. But when you think about this in terms of your thoughts, it's like, why do I worry so much? Well, because my attention is kind of addicted to worrying. And not really consciously. Like I'm not like waking up and being like, all right, mind, let's worry. It's just like without active awareness, without mindfulness, my mind will follow these patterns of thought. And the more it follows those patterns, the more those patterns are reinforced. And that we can practice following different patterns. And the Buddha gives us some helpful practices around loving kindness and compassion and sympathetic joy or gratitude and equanimity. where we can brainwash ourselves. We can say, may I be at ease, brainwash ourselves with kindness and gentleness and patience towards ourselves and towards others. And we can practice reconditioning the mind. So whatever actions of thought, of speech, of behavior get practiced, they get stronger. And remember that wisdom from a Buddhist perspective is interested in, and I would say maybe only interested in, what are the causes and conditions of suffering and what leads to its release. And the Buddha says on a subtle level what causes suffering is tanha and upadana, craving and clinging, reactivity. So if I take worry for an example, if there's something going on in my life that there's fear around, it's not that I'm judging the fear or saying I shouldn't feel afraid, but when I follow the worry and following this craving and clinging for certainty around something I don't have certainty around, I go through all the worst case scenarios, and what do I come up with? Shit. Right? Who is it? It's attributed to Mark Twain, said the worst moments in my life never came true. Right? And the Buddha is actually saying, let's look directly at the mind. Let's not say, stop worrying, you idiot, or why are you feeling afraid about the impending uncertainty of your future? He's saying, let's actually look at how much this reactivity is causing your suffering, like Mark Twain was hinting towards. How much of the worst parts of your life are caused by this internal reactivity? And we can start to practice not just being aware, but being aware with kindness. Oh, mind. Like this morning, self-doubt. Oh, wow, shit. Not taking it so personally and being gentle to the mind and being able to actually soften the grip on the thought. Have you all had that experience? Some of y'all that have meditated, like noticing that maybe over a 15, 20-minute, 30-minute period of meditation or having a meditation practice, that the thoughts can become less sticky. They still come up, but they're just like less sticky. It's like, I've seen that one before. I've seen every channel of my mind in over 7 months of silent retreat practice. Like, there's no new stuff. I actually went through this experience on a month retreat in New Mexico where I labeled these 6 different categories of thoughts, and all of my thoughts fell into these 6 categories. And I started going kind of crazy. I broke down in front of this monk and I was like, dude, my mind is just these 6 things. Like, I'm ready for it to stop. And I know the goal is not to stop your thinking, but please tell me how, because this is annoying. And it was all about, relaxing your relationship to those thoughts. Bringing compassion to the mind. Over and over, softening the grip, right? So the causes and conditions of suffering are craving and clinging and reactivity. And so karma is this idea that through active awareness, we can train our attention to unhook from some of the thoughts and let go of some of the thoughts, and also respond more compassionately. Right? To develop this quality of softness, of patience. Some of the other paramis, right? Patience. So to recap, and then we'll open it up, because I'm curious what y'all have to say. For me, wisdom is not about intellect. It's not a feature of your personality. Even on the outside, you look like a Yoda. It's not about acting perfectly. Wisdom is not an absence of reactivity in your heart and mind. Wisdom and reactivity can co-arise and can happen at the same time. Wisdom is seeing into the nature of your experience here and now. So wisdom is always available by simply slowing down and being curious about what's happening in the heart and the mind. The thoughts, the attitudes, the feelings, the sensations. And then wisdom also looks into those thoughts, feelings, sensations, and starts to see, as we steady the heart and the mind, we start to see these causes of identity, like this morning for me, these self-made stories. We start to see where our fears or our resistances, our reactivity towards unpleasantness in our life, or our expectations or our preferences, or all of these little things are forms of craving and clinging, and we can start to soften. So we develop insight by looking into the nature of our experience directly. Wisdom is the understanding that suffering exists. It's not a complacent understanding, it's an engaged understanding. Suffering exists. And as we steady our heart and our mind, knowing that you're not going to get over that anytime soon, the Buddha calls it a gradual course, a gradual training. He calls enlightenment a process of, like the slope of an ocean gradually shelves down into the water. He says, so too, this Dharma is a gradual training. As we look into the nature of our experience over time, we start to see the craving and the clinging, we start to let go. As we start to let go a little, we start to trust we can let go a little more. As you start to let go a little more, you start to trust that you can let go a lot. And I'm not there yet, but I've heard if you start to let go completely, you start to see that there's complete freedom in letting go. And this isn't complacently letting go, but it's through engaging with suffering, we can let go of the reactivity. Karma is action. It means we can engage in these moment-to-moment experiences. We can cultivate awareness. We can train our attention to unhook. We can cultivate heartfelt responsiveness, compassion, letting it in. And over time, this cools down the fire of our reactivity. For me, some of the aversion and some of the resistance is replaced with empathy. My first thought isn't always, fuck that person. It's sometimes, oh man, I think they're really struggling. And I'm going to have a good boundary with that person. I hope they find peace and the causes of peace in this lifetime, genuinely. And I know that their peace and happiness is also my own. And so ultimately, this leads and allows for more capacity to engage in the liberation of all beings. It ends up not becoming about me. Why do I meditate? Because my meditation practice on an ultimate level is for all of us. Because there's a ripple effect of when I show up with kindness, when I show up with less reactivity, when I show up with listening ears, when I have empathy and compassion, rather than defensively jumping to my views and opinions. You know, it's better for me, it's better for the world, and it has an effect on those around me. It's a really powerful thing. For any of y'all that have chosen to just be kind to like a store clerk or a customer service agent when you really didn't want to, and just seeing like almost a thankfulness sometimes I felt in their voice. Like some of these like AT&T customer service, it's like, oh, what a relief this person's not yelling at me right now. I'm like, that's actually a gift, you know? It seems like one that should just be given all the time, but I know it's hard for me and it can be a gift. So there's a ripple effect when we realize that this practice isn't just for me. These are my thoughts and reflections. Of course, I would love to hear yours. You don't have to be an expert of anything, obviously, other than being a human. We all have wisdom. We call this Buddha nature. You have it. You've had it for a long time. So whether you know it or not, or believe it or not, that's okay.
What's up, y'all? Reverend Mikey Noshel here from Wild Heart Meditation Center in Nashville, Tennessee. Thanks for checking us out. Do me a favor, please like and subscribe. And if you feel moved to leave a donation, you can do so at wildheartmeditationcenter.org or the Venmo link in the description. Peace and love.